Oh, hey guys, welcome to Friday Night Bible Study. Through the book of Romans, verse by verse, I'm going to jump right in it. We have Romans. Keep this in mind that the book of Romans um, is one of the, I'm not one of the, I want to say it is the greatest treatment on salvation. We are doing a slow crawl through Romans. By the time we reach chapter 8, you will have a thorough understanding. And then what that should do is you should have a solid understanding and great confidence in why you are saved. When I tell people this, I know that I know that I know that I am saved. I know that I'm going to heaven. I have no doubt. And I make that bold proclamation based on what we're going to study here in Romans. Not only Romans. Let me say this because oftentimes I'm more apt to get into debates. My wife, my wife knows just as much as I know, but she won't debate. You can't get past the first sentence. If you say I disagree, that's where she's not going to too much hang with you too much. Me, I'm going to debate. Well, I say that because, in when you talk about salvation and then you talk about, let's just use the kind of a general phrase. So once saved, always saved. Okay. The once saved, always saved debate. There are those that believe that once you're saved, you are saved for eternity. I fall into that. From here to chapter 8, I'll make my case. Most of Christianity, however, to one degree or the other, some stronger, some other, but most of Christianity believe that you have to earn your way to heaven. Most Christianity believes that the cross is not sufficient, that Jesus, okay, yeah, he died on the cross for our sins, but you have to bring it home. You have to bring it across the finish line. And you do that by living a certain way. You do that by not committing certain sins, okay? And so um, when I say that I know that I'm saved, it's because of what Jesus has revealed to us. So um, in Romans, and when I go back to the argument, let me just kind of go back to the argument. I want to make this point. I almost forgot. When I go back to the argument of the once saved, always saved, when like if you say that people are going to lose their salvation and the scriptures that they use, all of them, every single time, that they draw scriptures from passages that is not teaching on the subject of salvation. So you have to understand that. And that's part of the problem is that they invent entire entire theologies on scriptures. I gave this illustration last time. I gave this illustration last time where you have people. Let's say you go to a school. Okay, you go to a school, let's say you go to a school, and in this school, right, you have various subjects being taught by various teachers, right? That's kind of what school is about. So if you go up and you say, here's class 101, the subject is salvation. And then you go, here's class 102. The subject is um, uh, prophecy, end times. Then here is class 103, Old Testament studies, right? So when you go in the various classes, we can go on and on, right? And break up the Bible in various ways. When you go to those classes, the main subjects are going to be taught of those subjects. So now to go back to 101, when you have the main subject of salvation, that this is what is being taught. You go to 102, the main subject is going to be end times. Now, if you're in 102, you may have a statement concerning salvation. And what happens with people is they draw their, if you draw your theology on salvation from classroom 102, it's just not going to be enough. Now, so for example, you have the same thing with the subject of baptism, where people say you have to get baptized in water. You got to get baptized in water for Jesus, right? For Jesus to save you. The blood is not enough. You got to have H2O. All right, so you get baptized in water, because and so the argument of water baptism, that they never get it from classroom 101. Now, let me bring it home here too. So in the Bible, and I'm going to use the term baptism because in 1 Peter chapter 3, where it says, and now baptism saves you. And their theology, that's one of their foundational verses that they build the entire theology of baptism on. But they never go to, as we are going to travel through slowly, Romans 3, Romans 4, Romans 5, Romans 10, Galatians. So there are different books whose main subject is salvation, and they never draw scriptures from those books. Romans, Galatians, Ephesians, Colossians, Hebrews, where you're teaching on the subject of salvation. And then if they go to Romans or they go through Hebrews, they're going to pick verses where they're not talking about the 101 of what salvation is. That's the error. That's the point. That's the error there. Okay. So that's why as we go through Romans here, and as I said, we are going through it in a slow manner. So it's going to take us a while to get through Romans. And but when you get through it, when we get to again chapter 8, you're going to see how you will know that you know that you know that you are saved. Beyond a shadow of a doubt, you're going to know that you're saved, okay? And you're going to know why that you're saved. You're going to know why, and you're going to know why and how to stand on it. Okay? All right. So, as we get into chapter 1, I want to mention this before we jump into it. We're talking about, as we go from here to chapter 3, one of the things that Paul is going to unveil is man's sin, the depravity of man. And this is important to understand the why. See, why do we need to be saved? Why do we need to be saved? And the reason why is because we are dead in sin. And what Paul is bringing out as we go on is just how bad this depravity is. Now, one of the things I'm trying to avoid as we talk about the depravity of man, because we're at the part where he's talking about homosexuality. The point is, he's not only talking about homosexuality, but that these verses, unfortunately, have been made a political and social platform. And then as a result, this is the battle that uh, conservative Christians have made, and they're losing the battle. So they're losing the battle with abortion. They're losing the battle with homosexuality. So as I get into it, I'm going to get into is it a sin or is it not a sin? What I'm trying to avoid is I don't want to get into the social aspect because that has polluted the message. That now we can't really talk about the message because we have to talk about the hypocrisy of a lot of the conservative Christians and how they kind of approach as if abortion and homosexuality are the two main things, even from the throne of God, that God has fallen off his throne over these issues, okay? And 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 he's not. But let's jump to it. So I'm gonna go back. Let's see here. Uh Verse 26. I'll pick it up at verse 26. He says, "This is why God delivered them over to degrading passions." Now again, remember the statement here that he's making is because when they knew God, they did not know him as excuse me, as God. Oh, excuse me. I'll go back and read. Okay, I'm going to read from verse 18, but I'm going to resist. The reason why, truthfully, I have to try not to dive into these passages that we have went over in detail here. But anyway, just to keep the mindset. He says, For God's wrath is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of people who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. So this is where the statement he's making here. They suppress the truth. This is where we're going to end up at with the homosexuality, but other things. He says, since what can be known about God is evident among them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, that is, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen since the creation of the world, being understood through what he has made. As a result, people are without excuse. For though they knew God, they did not glorify him as God or show gratitude. Instead, their thinking became nonsense and their senseless minds were darkened. So in other words, you turn away from the light. If you're in a dark room, right? Let me do this, okay? So if you're in a dark room, just like now, you're in a dark room, you can't see. Now y'all can hear my voice, but you can't see. But then somebody comes and they're going to shed the light, right? But if you like, oh, put the thing back, so what are you in? You're in darkness, so you can't see because you're in darkness. Now, because you're in darkness, what's going to happen? You're going to fall further and further into darkness. You're going to fall. And that's we see here. You start with now rejecting God. So now your minds become senseless in darkness. Okay. That's why I said before, even the time of this writing here, as Paul is writing in Romans, you know what is interesting? They boasted in their superior knowledge, their wisdom, their and yet, on the other hand, they had multiple pagan deities that they worship. They had beliefs in pagan, deities. All right, so verse 22, claiming to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man, birds, four-footed animals, and reptiles. Therefore, God delivered them over to the cravings of their heart, to sexual impurity. Now, understand that this is not the only one. This is not the only as we get into the homosexual part, the gay part, right? But understand, this is not the only. God delivered them over to the cravings of their heart. I told you this last time that since I'm on YouTube and Facebook as a platform, you know, and every now and then I'm seeing more and more images. I'm going to put it like this, just plain out bestiality. And by the way, it's coming from women, where you have these, you have a dog that comes between their legs, you know, sniffing and licking all that kind of stuff. But it's increasing. Okay, so this is what I'm saying, the sexual impurity. He says so that their bodies were degraded among themselves. So it's not just homosexuality. It's the idea of fornication is every deviant sexual activity outside of the God ordained marriage. He says, verse 25, they exchange the truth of God for a lie and worship and serve something created instead of the Creator who is praised forever and ever. Verse 26, this is why God delivered them over to degrading passions, for even their females exchanged natural sexual relations for unnatural ones, and the male in the same way also left the natural relations with females and were inflamed in their lust, okay, for one another, males committing shameless acts with males, and receive in their own persons the appropriate penalty for their error. Um, so what does Paul mean by appropriate penalty? And the reason I wanted to say this because there have been ignorant pastors in the past that have blamed homosexuality for such things as AIDS and herpes, things like that. And in fact, there was two that actually even said that. They even blamed 9/11 on, I think, gays and homosexuality. Okay, this kind of nonsense that you see from some of these ministers is just beyond belief. Okay, because if you stop and go back to blaming the homosexuals for the AIDS, right? Um, you go back to that, and all of us, again, it's just so nonsense. Because think about all of the innocent wives and husbands, right? Yeah, if you stop and think about, even now, and let me just say this, AIDS is still around. So if I go out and cheat on my wife, now my wife is innocent, but I go out and cheat, I get AIDS. Now, AIDS and herpes, by the way, they are still incurable. They are just better managed medically by medicine. Well, back when it came out in the 80s, and I'm old enough to be come through that. There was no cure. People were dying, dropping like flies. Now, not with herpes. Herpes was just bad. Okay, herpes was just bad. And so, like I can think of two, and I'm not going to name them, but I can think of two uh, celebrities. One has herpes, another one has AIDS, and has been living with AIDS um, since the 90s. But they're rich and they have money, whereas a lot of people didn't. I've known people who have died of AIDS. And this was a Christian that died of AIDS. This was back in the 90s. They died of AIDS. And what was interesting about this sister that I know of, I don't know where she contracted. I don't know where she contracted from. I don't know if it's from her husband or someone else. But that was kind of the issue right here. So my point is, you just can't say it was a gay thing because if I go out and cheat and I get AIDS and then I come home and bring it to my wife, now she has AIDS, or vice versa. She goes out and cheat, next thing you know, she gives it to me and I have AIDS. So it's not just a gay thing, and it was just completely stupid because of the social and the political platform that was being peddled. Now here, and we're just kind of dealing with the scripture of it here, of the deviant behavior, sinful behavior. And I kind of dealt with it last time that if you just go with, notice what he says right here, this is for the females exchange natural sexual relations with unnatural ones. And when I hear scientists, and I hear scientists that will say, not on this issue, but just kind of that the creation that came from natural processes is so nonsense to me. And they think it's perfectly fine. They think it's perfectly fine. And I say that because in all of the arguments or defense for the LGBT lifestyle, now get this, I'm saying from a biblical perspective. So I want to be careful to say, I'm not going to protest. I remember years ago, there was, I was in the church, and this was really even before how conservatives were. I worked at a hotel, and I remember there, and they still have them. I worked at a hotel, and they would have an LGBT convention, and I remember the sister wanted to go down, and she wanted to protest the convention. I'm saying, why, why? Well, first of all, they wanted to aim the protest at the hotel for having the convention. I go, they're making money. They filled up the hotel. They got bankers. They're making money. They're making the money they want to make. So why would they give into that? And secondly, but why do you care? Why are you giving so much attention to that? Here's my point. There are other sins. That's my point. I've worked like look, I could tell you that other than their appearance and knowing the name that it's kind of it's the LGBT convention. I've worked with them. They were never a problem. They were never a problem, and certainly no more than anybody else that was a problem. Um, if you want to say the person who had more problems, okay, how about the heterosexuals that would tear up the place, fight? They would do their deviant acts open. Security was always called for them. Now again, I'm putting them in a category, God delivering them over to degrading passions. All of them, see, all of them. So as we look at this, but Paul is simply explaining to us, this is the reality, the truthfulness of it. So if you say is from a biblical standpoint, is homosexuality wrong? Yes, it is, just like adultery. But Paul here, and this is one of the strongest. This is one of the strongest. These two verses that Paul says right here, he comes right out and says, exchanging the natural sexual relation. Females exchanging the natural. So what would be a natural relationship versus an unnatural one? And we live in a society now where you get in trouble for criticizing. You get a lot of blowback for criticizing. However, let's look at the logic then. So number one, I'm going to say, as a person, let's kind of go back up here. As a person, in verse verse 21, for though they knew God, they did not glorify him as God or show gratitude. Instead, their thinking became nonsense and their senseless minds were darkened. So in other words, the real problem is rejecting God. Remember, and you in the darkness, rejecting God. So now God says, okay, delivering them over to degrading passions. So the real problem is not, as he's explaining, right, homosexuality, but he's also going to explain other sins that's just as bad. But if you want to talk about the argument of and because that's been put into play on the platform, so now you have even people that will say that this is not talking about homosexuality. And they're going to say, well, the Greek is talking about male prostitutes or pedophilia, something like that. Anyway, but that's again for the females exchange the natural sexual relations for that of unnatural one. Now, there's a couple of things that's important to look at here. Notice he said that's why God delivered them over the degrading passions. So remember that there are people who have inclinations for that I cannot explain, but they originate out of the sinful nature. They originate out of the sinful nature. You go back to that. Remember I said the darkness? See, because in the darkness, because they don't have the light, now I'm being driven by the gratitude. I mean, the gratification. So what is a natural relation? We go back when God made male and female. He made a male with a male genitals. He made female with a female genitals. They fit. I'll say the greatest sexual experience is between a male and a female. That's not to say you can't. I'm trying to. That's not to say when I say, because I'm trying to be very, very G-rated here. That's why you see me stumbling here. I'm trying to be G-rated. But between a man and put it like this, between a man and a wife, God does not put any restrictions. Think about that. Now, some churches do, which is always funny to me that you have some churches that's all in your business, all in your bedroom, okay, which they shouldn't be there. But now, if you are in the darkness, let me do this again. If you're in the darkness, then you don't have the light. So if you're in the darkness, you're not going to have the light of natural relations and unnatural relations. You're in the darkness. You're feeding your gratifications. You're forming thoughts. You're forming mindsets apart from God's word. So that's why I said they exchange this. If you are a little boy, I can remember being a little boy, being fascinated with fire, right? And I remember one time, pouring a little gas, boom, wow! I was, excited about that. Now I could have been an arsonist, right? Ooh, because I love fire. There was some correct amount. No, we don't play with fire. I think back then one of the things that I poured too much gas and burnt a little gas, and that's why I think that was part of the problem with that. And again, the person came out and yelled at me. I think it was, because I was doing it in front of somebody's house. That's why. But anyway, my point is that you could form all kinds of mindsets if you're in the darkness, and this is one of them. Now, what Paul's simply saying is, hey, here's the natural, here's the unnatural. What makes it unnatural? Male upon male, female upon female. So he says, the males in the same way also left the natural relation with the females and were inflamed in their lust for one another, males committing shameless acts with males, receiving their own persons the appropriate penalty of their error. Now, so now he goes on and says, verse 28, and because they did not think it worthwhile to acknowledge God. And so here's the thing, right? They didn't acknowledge God. So now they develop, you can go from bad to worse. In the society that Paul lived in here, as he's writing this, there were all kinds of deviant activities going on, especially in the upper echelons of the Roman. And if you were a slave, and a good-looking slave at that, you were abused. And that's what you have. This is why, again, you in the deviant mind, you have a man that'll rape, or a woman, mostly men, but because what? That's the deviant. Notice they did not like to acknowledge God. So the starting point and the finishing point is the reason why society is that way is because they don't acknowledge God. Now, how do you change that? Not laws, because we already had, especially in America, we already had laws. There's laws right now. You can't rape anybody. You can't murder anybody. They did have adultery laws, and I think maybe some jurisdictions still may have them on the books and it's never enforced them. But so the laws doesn't work because again, you still have deviant people. When I see a man who's obsessed with his ex and then ends up killing her, I don't get that. See, that's again, you're not acknowledging God. So you start with acknowledging God, and then he says, God delivered them over to a worthless mind to do what is morally wrong. Now, I did show you a few studies ago this term, worthless mind. In the King James, it says reprobate. And this is one of these words that can be kind of transliterated. The Greek word is not reprobate, but a lot of people kind of thought in terms of a reprobate mind. Okay, what is a reprobate mind? That you went mad or insane. That's not the term. But what it did mean was, here's the illustration. It was after attempting to reach a person, trying to appeal to a person, trying to change a person, and they keep rejecting, that God says, you can say, stamps reprobate. Think of it this way. If a nation, a company has a new invention, let's say they're going to design a chair, and in this chair, they said, well, this chair can hold 1,000 pounds. I'm going to keep this simple. The chair can hold 1,000 pounds. So they mark it up. They have a prototype. Boom. Now they're going to test the chair. If you say it can hold 1,000 pounds, put 1,000 pounds on it. They put 1,000 pounds on it and it collapsed. Well, what's going on? Okay, bring in another prototype. Okay, let's check it again. Bring in another prototype. Put 1,000 pounds on it. It collapsed. Wow, what's going on? Third time, put 1,000 pounds on it. It collapsed. The third one collapsed. So then you can say, let's stamp reprobate, rejected. Something's wrong with this. This is not working. It keeps failing the test. And that's what he's saying right here. That, notice it, and because they did not think it worthwhile to acknowledge God, God turned them over or delivered them to a reprobate mind or a worthless mind. It's a reject. You keep rejecting. So the result of people who keep rejecting God That's what happens. And that's what the term reprobate means. Now, as we're reading, a worthless mind. And then he says to do what is morally wrong. They're going to keep going in their ways. So in other words, no matter what you say, no matter how you, and this is something, the sinful nature, if you remember, if you read the Bible, let me just put it this way. If you read the Bible, from Genesis to Revelation, one of the revelations is the exposing of the sinful nature. You start with Adam's sin. And this is important because this is kind of where we get here. By far, Adam has to be the most baffling human to me. You go back to Adam and you hear the man who had everything. He had everything. Literally the world. So God creates man in his own image. The ability to think, feel, to reason. And you can imagine how Adam was when God created him. You can imagine the perfect human being. People kind of argue about his age. I think it's irrelevant because whatever his age is, he was in perfect health, perfect everything, in a perfect climate. God makes him a helpmeet, Eve. She's perfect, smoking hot. The perfect couple, right? Hallmark, better than a Hallmark, and they didn't need the Christmas and all that kind of stuff. But anyway, God, they have the little of the world. They could travel the world. They could, and then they had their own personal paradise, the garden. Life was perfect for them. So, now God gave them one command: don't eat of the tree, the fruit of the tree that's in the middle of the garden. Don't eat of it. And you could philosophically want to debate why God put the tree in. I personally think it's irrelevant because He said, "Don't eat of the tree." That's hard enough. Don't do it. All right. So now Adam eats of the fruit. If you go back to the story in Genesis 3, you see that the devil deceived Eve. She don't get off because the consequences of the sin were still the same. But Adam, and I know that I used to always kind of get this idea that Adam was out somewhere. He's out someplace away, and then, the snake slithered up to Eve and started whispering in her ear. No, Adam was standing right there with his woman. And watch the serpent seduce Eve. And then he made a conscious choice. He made a conscious choice to sin. And that's baffling to me. That first sin. Why? Why did Adam, who lived in the presence of God, why did he do it? That's the troubling question that I hope I get to ask when I get to heaven. At some point in eternity, right? And but you have to understand how grievous that was that he made that choice to sin. I'm sinning against God. I know what the command is. He's not confused over that. I'm sinning against God. So that act, as you see expressed by Adam, is woven from Genesis to Revelation. You see it from Genesis to Revelation. It is, you think about think about the sons uh, uh, of Jacob. You think about when after God delivers the nation of Israel from Egypt. What do? 3 months later, they build a calf and say, "This is the God that delivered us from Egypt. That we want to go back to slavery." And then we can just kind of go on through. When Peter denied Jesus, and Jesus was right there. Jesus turned and looked at Peter. Right? We can come all the way through. Then how could a person act this way in the circumstances that they were in? Then we come even to the book of Revelations, the final, how the beast will gather his armies and fight against the coming Jesus. They're destroyed. Now get this. And then Jesus reigns for 1,000 years. So there are people who are living on earth during this time under the reign of Jesus, the goodness of Jesus, the prosperity of Jesus. If you died at 100, people would think you a child. That's how good things are. Now Jesus is also strict. The Bible says he rules with a rod of iron. But at the end of the 1,000 year, the Bible says Satan is let loose from the prison. He goes out and deceives those people who had been living with Jesus under Jesus' reign for 1,000 years. Now, what am I saying? Nature, of man, and we see this in the Bible, the sin nature. The sin nature. That it's unbelievable, the sin nature. So he says, when you don't acknowledge God, where you end up is rejected, a worthless mind, a reprobate mind. That's where you end up. You stay in darkness. You stay in depravity. God gives you over to your way. Now, ultimately, you're going to face the judgment of God. You're going to face the judgment of God for those actions, for that not acknowledging God. So the difference between, let's say, us, those who believe, and those who, let's say, are turned over to a reprobate is they did not acknowledge God. I acknowledge God. I acknowledge the mercy of God. Okay, which we'll get to later. Why? But notice that's the point. So now when you have the world repeatedly rejects God, you're going to have darkness. This is why you had Noah's flood. So Noah's flood was how bad sin can get, to the point God said, let me just wipe him out. That's why you had Sodom and Gomorrah. Why? Because this is how bad sin can get. But you also had the same interest at the end of the book of Judges, where the tribe of Benjamin did the same thing that Sodom and Gomorrah did, how bad sin can get. And remember, in the book of Judges, unlike Sodom and Gomorrah, they had God's law. So what happens? You end up being rejected. So you see that during, again, Noah's flood, Sodom and Gomorrah. Israel ultimately, because of their sin, that's why you had the Babylonian invasion, which was a judgment against God, because what? At some point, God would even say, you all who have the law of God are worse than the pagans. All right, guys, don't forget to like and share this video and subscribe to BP the Bible Perspective. And as always, if you have a thought or comment, add it to the comment section below. All comments are welcome. And I will see you next Friday.